Welcome to the Afro-Global conversation, where we discuss all global issues from an African perspective. Today we are going to discuss the Kenya-US trade deal that was announced on 6th of February 2020. Some of the issues that stand out is that from the Washington Post, they say that the Trump administration is trying to counterweight the Beijing's influence in Africa. The second issue is that could Kenya be used as a template for future bilateral trade agreements for the African continent? Then the last issue is it possible for Kenya to have this trade deal and still maintain its obligation with its partners in the East African community? To start with, I have this very beautiful panel. And to start with, I would want to first tackle the issue of the US countering influence of the Chinese in Africa. And my friend will take us through this.
Okay, on the issue of the US trying to counter the Chinese influence in Africa, we know that the US has lost ground in recent years in terms of how it used to engage partners in Africa. For a long time, the Chinese have made the headwinds within the African continent. Countries like Kenya pursued a look east policy after having been frustrated by the conditionalities, what they would call interference by the Western into the political systems of their countries. But now the US is trying now to regain, through the Trump administration, that the ground that it lost. We know that the Chinese deal, where we had no attachments in terms of the engagement, there's no interference in issues of governance, politics and human rights, is proving to be somewhat questionable in terms for the future of Africa. Now the US is trying to regain what it had, the partnerships that it had with the continent. And for that reason, the competition, even for the dwindling global resources, has brought the competition back to Africa. We are wondering if is it the second scramble for the continent? Yeah.
Out of curiosity, my brother Robinson, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, was embarked on his tour of the African continent a week ago. Where he warned the African states of the dangers of the Chinese investment and those kind of loans. Are we becoming proxies of these two big powers who are involved in a trade war?
Most definitely. Every partner that is engaging Africa is pursuing its own self-interests. So it has to paint the other partner as our far worse partner, or it has to come in a way that it shows that it can engage the partner in a more cordial, the continent in a more cordial manner. It has a better deal, it cares for the interests of the continent than the other partner. So the continent is at the point where it's caught in between power relations. You can remember the Cold War period when the continent was caught in between the East and Western blocks for political or ideological competition. Now it is an economic time for the resources that are on the continent. So it's a time that the continent finds itself again in a place of competition or a battleground for the big powers, emerging, those powers that had fallen like the USSR. Now we have Russia now coming back to the continent to trying to compete for deals in terms of trade, resources, and what the continent can offer.
Africa seems to be becoming very attractive, especially to the European Union, the Western world, and the Chinese. All those countries, they are all trying to be part of this. But there's something that is very important for us to discuss in this. US has shifted from its traditional approach to issues of trade negotiations, and now they are focusing more on bilateral rather than multilateral negotiations. What's your take on that approach?
Well, what we have seen in the current global arena, it's a case of economic nationalism, whereby every big country, that is, we talk of US, we talk of China somehow, and we talk of UK by leaving the Brexit. They are adopting policies that tend to move, to shift from multilateral policies towards what we call bilateral policies. But for Africa to emerge as a power, we need to read well the impact this economic nationalism by the big powers will have on our own relations and the relations we have with the rest of the world. But for Africa to reap or to gain from the globalization that is in this 21st century, we must seek more collective or common goals and integration, as we see through the African Continental Free Trade Area, which the US seems to be a barrier by seeking a bilateral deal with Kenya, which has granted or disgruntled members from the EAC and Africa at large. So Africa needs to be careful in how it trades with the economic nationalism that we are seeing from the north.
There is no way that the deal is going to compromise on Kenya's obligations to those arrangements that you have mentioned in Africa.
From the reactions that you have had, even from the East Africa community and other partners within the African states at large, because as you know, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area provides that for any country to enter into any other bilateral deal with another country that is not party to the Continental Free Trade Area, it must inform or what we call seek or we say participate, not participate, it must engage the other partners so that they get what we call clearance. But in essence, every country is free to seek any deal in the international system. You know, it can be described as a template for US to enter into Africa. But what I see, it's something that is proposed. It's not yet over. Kenya can be used as an entry point to Africa, a multilateral deal with Africa, because we are seeing AGOA is going to expire in 2025, and Kenya can go there to the US and negotiate for Africa, not for itself. So, of course, it has impacts to our trade arrangements and our obligations in the continent, but also we must consider the fact the state factor. The state is a rational, egoistic actor in the international system. So Kenya considers the various payoff structures that we can gain. The intra-Africa trade, the quality or the capacity or the quantity of intra-Africa trade is far much low than how we can trade with the US or China at the bilateral level. So every country will seek economic gain over any multilateral deal that does not offer anything that is in their interest.
I totally agree and your concerns on this issue, but I want to ask my friend Steve right here. Is it possible that Kenya is running away from failures that we have witnessed with our commitments with our friends in East Africa and the African continent at all, to go and find a new partner in the US who can benefit it more?
As Kenya tries to trade with the rest of the international system, if you look at what Nigeria trades with the US and what Kenya trades with the US and Chad and Angola and South Africa, it's almost to assume Kenya is trading peanuts. So I think the conversation should be how what Kenya wants to reap from the United States. Because if you look at what the United States gives us in terms of machinery and military support, what we get from them is almost like a roadie. So the conversation should move from what's Kenya gaining from this engagement.
That's a great lead to our next issue. And out of this trade deal, I think the most important thing that we need to ask ourselves as Kenyan people is, are we benefiting maximally from this deal that we are about to go into negotiate? And some of the issues that might stand out is we already trade with the US through the AGOA, the Growth and Opportunity Act, which people say it was supposed to expire in 2025, but that is to be determined by the regime that will be in power at the time. Currently, Trump seems to be very committed to issues of bilateralism, and he has mentioned on several occasions that he will not renew the deal on AGOA. But most important, the trade between the US and Kenya in 2018 was recorded at $1 billion. And somehow Kenya seems to export around 470 million US dollars to the US. Is it possible that we can benefit from balance of trade in these countries? Is it possible that we can export the much that we can import from the US in this trade deal? And I think this question will squarely go to Felicitas, and also touch on the issues of the Chinese and the issues of the purchasing power and the production in China and the US in terms of comparison.
Thank you, Chris. The first question we really need to ask ourselves, what's the comparative advantage? What's the best product we're getting? What are we really getting from the trade agreement between Kenya and the US? An example is the fact that what we're getting, the products we're getting from the US are really they are capital intensive products compared to what we get from China. And if we look at the products that will come into our country at the end of the day, they'll end up being very expensive to other consumers. And what we'll be sending out to the US won't have so much, I don't think we'll benefit so much as a country compared to what we'll be sending out to the US. In regards to the comparative advantage, the US already has policies and subsidies to their local manufacturers. For example, farmers. What Kenya exports so much to the US are agricultural products. Where are our farmers when you get into this deal? The subsidies and policies we have, they won't really benefit our farmers and our local manufacturers.
If I may add to what my colleagues have said, let's look at Nigeria. Nigeria looks, if I stand corrected, exports oil to the US. Looking at Kenya, we're looking at tea and coffee. We need to see how we can value add our products so that once they live here, they live as finished goods. That one will give us more comparative advantage, as what my colleague was saying.
Out of concern, is it possible that Kenya can benefit from this trade deal between Kenya and the US in terms of technology transfer, whereby we can make Kenya a manufacturing and processing hub, whereby all African countries, instead of exporting their raw materials to the West for manufacturing and processing, can we utilize this opportunity to tap into the other obligation that we have made with our African brothers and sisters through the African Continental Free Trade Area, through the East African Community Custom Union protocols and the Common Market protocols, all the way up to the Political Federation? Is it possible that we can benefit from this deal in terms of technology transfer, whereby all those products, all of them, in terms of raw materials, they can come to us, then we manufacture, we process and sell to our African brothers? What's your take, Mr. Suleiman?
On this issue, we have in our country, in Kenya, we transport oil from Turkana to British, which is a very rogue initiative. We have countries like German, whereby they're bringing their Chevrolet company to build their machineries in Kenya, and they use our own things and build the machineries and sell them to other countries in Kenya and across. So I think this will be a better deal for the Kenya government to improve our economy.
In addition to the question, we have to understand the nitty-gritties of free trade area between two countries. We have got the infrastructure from China. Now, Kenya is a middle-income country within the sub-Saharan Africa. We are seeking to have more investment. So this one will open, this deal with the US, the proposed one, will open us to investment. We import a lot of agricultural machineries from the US. And Kenya exports raw agricultural produces to the US, but not in a bigger, because US imports very little quantities of food products. So we can use it to bring in more investments, transfer of technology, and will increase our capacity in the global value chain by exporting more of processed food or agricultural produce than what we are doing now. And this will be beneficial to the country and to the normal citizen and farmers wherever they are within the country or the region.
Also, to add on what my colleague has said, I think the history of the continent is very clear. We know in the 1980s we had policies known as the structural adjustment programs. And one of the conditions was that the countries that in the developing world were to produce raw and processed goods as part of the conditions by the Bretton Woods institutions, that's the World Bank and the IMF. It falls upon the African leadership. What lessons did we learn? And for one, Kenya has a pillar under the Big Four agenda. One of the pillars is manufacturing. So we can use this opportunity to really boost that pillar and make sure we boost our manufacturing industry, we create jobs, and make sure that the products that leave the country, they bring more maximum benefits, because once they go, they are gone. And maybe make sure we earn the foreign exchange that we can use to benefit the continent, even beyond the country, and we set the way for even the continent to engage external partners.
I have a question for you, Morgenthau. You've talked about the manufacturers, but is Kenya really ready? Where are our manufacturers? Can we sustain? Can our manufacturers sustain exporting products to the US?
Yeah, I believe the quality is there. We have the capacity, we have the technical know-how to do it. It's about putting our house in order. Get rid of corruption. The policies are there. Kenya has very good programs. If you look at the EPZ, the export processing zones, we produce very quality goods from that part. So I know we have that capacity to do it. If we get the right support from the state and we get rid of the bureaucracy that may prevent the production of goods and services, we can get our house right in order and benefit from this deal.
Robinson, I just want you to look at this scenario. So we are a typical farmer and somebody in Japan or China where we import vehicles. So it takes, I want to assume it takes China or Japan 1 or 2 days to make a vehicle ready for the market. So a farmer here in Kenya or Africa will keep cows for how many years? 5, 4? So how many cows do you need to buy 1 car?
That's a very tough question, and I think it's something that we might need to relook in terms of capacity to be able to engage with the US, which we know is an economic powerhouse, so, and other countries. So we need to look at I think there's an issue of comparative advantage and things that we can do. But also remember that Japan do not have or own any natural resources. They assemble everything. They get things from different countries, they assemble in the countries and they sell. And the question was, is it possible that we can do the same? We can borrow from Japan and do the same in Kenya with this deal with the US? That was the big question. But moving forward, in the interest of time, there's another question that we want to ask. And this one I want to direct it to Mr. Ogoti. And it's the question of the Africa Growth Opportunity Act, the AGOA. They say in 2025 should expire, and maybe this deal between Kenya and the US is the first of the many that will follow in order to replace this deal. But Mr. Ogoti, the question is, the concern is, we already have an access to the US market through this Opportunity Act, and whatever we should export or whatever we think we should export to the US, we already export it, and we have been ranked top 5 in Africa in terms of countries that benefit from the US. What do you think? What are the future prospects of such kind of an arrangement coming in?
Of course, the AGOA bounded as Kenya in a bandwagon of African countries. So in such an arrangement, you don't have your interest. You have what we call common interest. You go there as Africa, right? So you may have conceded some of the interests that you had, so that you can sustain the regional arrangement. But now, when we go for a bilateral deal, which Kenya has advocated or has offered to negotiate, that seems to show that Kenya has other interests, because the AGOA covers much of garments, not much of apparels, and Kenya has more to export, because the garments are just the EPZ, that's just one sector, and Kenya relies much of the agricultural sector for its economy. So it's about having a deal that will cover much of the goods that we have, or the products that we have, to export. And also I have to add, the Kenya-US deal is dangerous to African unity and the integration when we go to regarding the African continental free trade area. Because when you look at the summits that Africa has with the rest of the countries, you see US-Africa summit, Pakistan-Africa, India-Africa, China-Africa summit, Russia-Africa. The only thing that seems to unite us in such summits is the photo session. There you'll see all the African presidents together. But after the photo session, we go to different rooms for bilateral deals. So it shows that the political goodwill and trust for African initiative and the collective movement in securing these deals is not there. So every country is self-interested. You have to go there alone. But Africa needs to know that we are a community of small economies against big economies. So when we unite, we'll have a better force and bargaining power in the international system. But also we have to be inward looking so that we may grow ourselves fast. We have the infrastructural connections, the capacities, and more of intra-Africa trade so that we can go to the rest of the world as a united front.
From that discussion, I think it would be prudent for us to discuss, because after the announcement which the president did in the US and in Addis Ababa on 6th, many scholars and policymakers, they have raised the issue of Kenya being in contravention of the East African Common Market Protocol and the African Continental Free Trade Area, and I think it will be important for us to discuss this issue, because when does it become when is it in contravention? Is it after the signing of the deal, or is it when you're initiating the deal for negotiation? You initiate the negotiation to follow. Is that the time when the Kenya should notify the Secretariat of the African Continental Trade Area, or should that be the time when Kenya should notify the East African Customs Union Secretariat?
Kenya has to engage even before, just by thinking that you can have a bilateral deal with any other country that contravenes the East Africa or African arrangements, must engage the other partners. But looking at what Kenya is facing in the East African community, from Tanzania, Uganda, there is a lot of trade unrest between these countries. So Kenya can go there and rattle these other. Kenya can go alone and say we can go alone if you don't want to be good neighbors. But of course Kenya has the principle of good neighborliness, so it's advisable that they engage, so that even if it goes there, it has in mind that we are here for Africa, for EAC as such. But also we need to develop our sub-regional blocks, because we have rushed to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, whereas whatever we started to build at the regional, sub-regional levels, these things have not even dried up. They are not strong enough for trade. We are still having some small chicken and cows issues with Tanzania, and the SGR, we failed to take it all the way to Rwanda. So such things, such things can force a country to seek solace somewhere else for self-interest.
We should always remember, umoja ni nguvu, utengano ni udhaifu. If Kenya really focuses so much on the Africa continent free trade area, I believe we'll have more advantage compared to having a bilateral trade agreement with the US.
For me, I think Kenya should go alone, since Kenya is aware of its interest in the global arena, whereby it wants like the United Nations Security Council, but it must get the support of it's supposed to be like the brainchild of this thing, whereby other African countries will follow up the African nation, the Kenyan country. But there's a thing we must ask ourselves as Kenyans, as Africans, whereby this thing is more like it will create like a disunity among Africans, since the African nations will see Kenya compromising other African states for its own benefit, which will be a unity test to the African continent.
Just wind up on the issue of whether Kenya should notify the East African community or this or that partner. To observe protocol, yes, we should in paper. The other thing is, remember, the conversation should be, I don't know why we're focusing much on the trade between Kenya and USA. Perhaps there should be, we should want to see more interaction between African countries. Remember, a Maasai can only sell more sugars in Nigeria or South Africa than he can do in the United States.
The trade deal between Kenya and the US can be seen in both ways as a beneficial move, at the same time can be seen as a compromising move or a way for Kenya to give more concessions to the US in this kind of deals. One of the issues that I think has come out of this discussion is that when you negotiate as a group, you're most likely to benefit from the issues of collective creative solution provisions rather than when you negotiate alone. And when you negotiate alone with a country like the US, which is known to be an economic powerhouse, it's very obvious that the US is going to push these small countries in terms of economy to give more concessions, even in issues that they do not need to be given those kind of concessions. On the other side, if we say that Kenya focuses on the African continent and the East African community, I think Kenya has learned from history, and the experience has been an history of disappointment, deception, and lack of seriousness in terms of implementation of the papers and the frameworks that we come up with. Remember, in 1980, we had a very good framework, the Lagos Plan of Action, which materialized into the Abuja Treaty 1991. In 2012-2015, that's when we picked up something that we left in 1991 to make it the African Continental Free Trade Area. Remember, in 1991, the agreement was in 39 years, we should be able to have a United States of Africa. Now, that dream, we have postponed it, and we have decided we need to have the Agenda 2063, which you say in 2063, we need to have a United States of Africa. Now, here's the challenge. If Kenya focuses on the intra-African trade, we all produce almost the same things. We produce raw materials, which benefits nobody. What if Kenya is telling these African continent countries what Moses told Pharaoh? Allow us to go and do good for ourselves. I think that was what Kenya is doing, and there is nothing that limits Kenya from negotiating any trade agreement with any other country. Remember, countries only survive to negotiate with others. Others, if you don't negotiate with others, definitely others are going to benefit above. In conclusion, the trade deal between Kenya and the US can be seen as a template for other deals to follow, but that will be determined with the regime that will be in place in the US at the time. Remember, what we have learned in politics is that regimes change everything. What was happening in Obama time, it has changed when Trump came in. Now, but the all indication seems like Trump is coming in again. But if the history will prove me wrong, then I hope someone else will come in, someone who has a heart for Africa and who still believes that multilateralism is still the way to go, especially when you're negotiating with countries in Africa and in other places who are thought to be more impoverished. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and keep on following our conversations on a weekly basis here on this channel. Thank you very much.